So I think that, I wanted to look into this to see what is Ibn Taymiyyah doing, and does he have lessons for us in our day? That's number one. But in his day, right, the main point of contention, one of the main points of contention, was the question of the divine attributes. Okay, so obviously the Quran, understood by Muslims to be the word of God, talks a lot about God, right, and ascribes many different attributes to God and describes God in many different ways. Some of these use words that would correspond to bodily attributes in a human being. Okay,
right.
So the Quran says, for example, Yadullahi fawqa aydihim, God's hand is above their hands. When the companions came to make a pact, it said God's hand was above their hands. Okay, it also says Bal yadahu mabsutatan, his two hands, meaning God's two hands, are stretched out. Right, innaka la bi'ayunina, you, Noah, are in our eyes. Okay, and then one of the most famously discussed and debated verses, well, it's actually several verses, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa, the all-merciful God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, has settled upon the throne, or has been, istawa, seated, or kind of, right? It's hard to even describe that without doing something like this, okay?
Yeah.
So the question is, what is meant by these expressions? Can they be understood literally, okay, that God literally has a hand, that he literally was seated upon the throne? Nobody denies the existence of the divine throne that kind of encompasses the universe, what we would call today the universe, okay? But the fact of God's, settling on it, what is meant by this? If it's the main contention is, okay, if you say God literally, now we can talk about what literal may or may not mean, but just the everyday understanding of it, if God literally settled on the throne, well, does that mean he has a body? Because we think, or is he a body? Because we think of bodies standing and sitting and settling on things, right? If you imagine God as a completely non-corporeal entity, if you imagine a completely non-corporeal entity like a mind, even a human mind, you would never talk about a mind like settling on a throne or sitting on anything, or you wouldn't speak about it that way because it's a non-material entity, okay? If God has a hand literally, right, quote unquote literally, well, isn't a hand this, right? And isn't this flesh and bones and something corporeal, something that can decay, something that's created, right? If God is described in these terms, what does that mean for the theology, right? A theology of transcendence, a theology of oneness, and so forth. So this is sort of the crux of the issue, right? And the early community, and Ibn Taymiyyah is keen to point this out, right? When these questions were raised, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that these were raised in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself and the companions. But these kinds of questions were raised fairly early on, but several generations later, as Muslims spread into the Near East and started mixing with other populations, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians in Persia, all these different philosophies, the Hellenistic heritage and so forth, and people started asking them, right? Christians had 600 years of a developed theology, and the Muslims are coming from the Quran and say, okay, well, you say this, well, what about that, And so this discussion started and questions are raised. And the question was, and then the idea was, came that, okay, well, if you assert these things literally, then you're basically talking about a God who's just a body, like an aggrandized human being, and what kind of God is that? And so you get early groups like the rising Mu'tazila, the early Mu'tazila, larger group, sort of spread of a group called the Jahmiyyah, which started saying, okay, well, we're just going to deny the hand, deny all these things, and deny the attributes altogether. We can't get into the details, right? So in the face of denying, like widespread denial of divine attributes, you have a number of early figures say, no, we assert the reality of these texts. There's a famous statement that's attributed to Imam Malik, who's very early, obviously. He says, al-istiwa'u ma'lum, the settling, right, is known, i.e. the meaning of it is known, wal-kayfu majhul, but the how of it, the modality of it, is unknown. Wal-imanu bihi wajib, was-su'alu anhu bid'ah, and believing in it is obligatory, theologically obligatory, and asking about it, meaning the how of it, is a reprehensible innovation, okay? So you have a lot of these sort of early statements. So Ibn Taymiyyah says, well, so we should uphold the meaning of it and simply deny that the modality of it, as it applies to God, is similar to how it applies to us, okay? So if I tell you the king of, whatever, Persia settled on the throne, you know that the king of Persia is a human being with a physical body, So him, istawa ala arshihi, okay, you know that he kind of just sat physically on his throne. Because God is not a human being, I can sort of understand the meaning of istiwa, and that goes back to the statement attributed to Imam Malik, al-istiwa ma'lum. It's known what that means, but the how of it when it pertains to God, who's totally laysa kamithlihi shay, it says in the Quran, there's nothing like unto him, right? How it applies to God is something that we cannot know. So we just pass it over and we don't dig into the modality, okay? Later on, and again, we can't get into all the reasons why and you claimed reasons and what each group says against the other. Later theological schools, particularly the later Ash'arism, does not find it does not stay kind of at that level, if you want, or it does not really kind of stop saying, okay, we affirm the attribute, but just don't get into the modality. There's a question of making ta'wil of or reinterpreting the attribute, okay? In order to, if you ask from that perspective, say, okay, well, you have all these people coming out who are crass anthropomorphists, and people who say, if you tell them istawa, God settled on the throne, literally, they're actually thinking like the king of Persia, like they're thinking of a human figure. And so to prevent this, we shouldn't say it's literal. We should say, okay, what's meant here is that God assumed, or exerted authority over the universe, right? It has a metaphorical meaning. It has an abstract meaning, okay? God's two hands are outstretched. This is a metaphorical use of language. That means he's very generous, right? The verse said, قَالَتِ الْيَهُودُ يَدُ اللَّهِ مَغْلُولَةٌ. The Jews, or some of the Jews said, God's hand is tied up, meaning stingy, right? And then it goes, غُلَّتْ أَيْدِيهِمْ, may their hands be tied up, بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ, rather, his two hands are wide stretched. So they'll say, well, clearly from the context, it's a question of God being stingy and not giving generously versus God giving generously. So the يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ, his two hands are wide outstretched, means God is very generous, right? And so we should just, نُؤَوِّلْ الْآيَةِ, or a sifa, make ta'wil of it, reinterpretation of it, in terms of a non-corporeal, in terms of a sense that can't possibly be understood as corporeal, I should say it that way, into a purely kind of abstract meaning, right? And then there's the tension between, okay, first of all, is it legitimate to interpret the language that way, right? Can you apply that consistently? And if you do, can you do it in a way such that you don't end up basically explaining away or interpreting away all of the divine attributes, which some of the early groups did, right? Before the Mu'tazila, and the Mu'tazila also to some degree, okay? Is there a non-arbitrary point at which you can say, okay, we'll deny these physical or seemingly physical attributes, but okay, what about, also later Ash'arism, you would know more about this. Okay, God doesn't really love, he doesn't really hate, because those are human attributes. So love means you have need of something, you have like shauq towards it. But this is anthropomorphic, because this is how these are human qualities, and to love something in that manner, kind of
inapplicable
in a deficiency, and God can't have a need in deficiency, so God can't love. But then Ibn Taymiyyah says, all of a sudden now you're telling me God doesn't love me, but he says, right, Allah loves the believers, right? يُحِبُّهُمْ وَيُحِبُّونَهُ, like he loves him and they love him, and you're saying, no, he doesn't really love. Well, wait a minute, but he says he loves, right? And so that's his problem. Like he wants to kind of retain and affirm the reality of the language used of God in Revelation in a realistic sense, such that the believer can access God through that language, rather than reading and being told, every 5 verses, okay, well, it doesn't really mean that, it doesn't really mean that. God can't love, he can't hate, he doesn't settle on the throne, he doesn't do this, because all of these, right? So the idea is like where, at what point is there a non-arbitrary point where you can say, like, these sifat, these attributes are overtly anthropomorphic if they're affirmed in a literal sense, so we will reinterpret them, whereas these other attributes, 80% or 90% or whatever percent, are, don't imply anthropomorphism, right? So he wants to get out of this altogether and try to come up with a philosophical model, if we can put it that way, whereby all of the attributes that are affirmed of God or spoken about in the Quran can be sort of unambiguously affirmed, ithbat, as-sifat, okay? But nevertheless, sort of get out of this danger of falling into what they call tashbih, assimilationism, i.e., assimilating God to created beings. Okay, we would say anthropomorphism. In English, that's actually, anthropomorphism means making God like a human being. That's part of it, but I mean, the idea is tashbih of any created thing, right? Not to assimilate God to any created thing, not just human beings. And a particularly odious form of tashbih, of assimilationism, is a subspecies of it known as tajsim, which is corporealism, right? So how can we affirm God's hand, God's, settling on the throne and so forth, without falling into corporealism or assimilationism? And so this is the problem that he's wrestling with. And again, he's trying to do that in order to preserve the reality and the kind of, the reality and the directness of the language use of God in Revelation. Right. And so that can be heard and understood and responded to in a way that moves the heart of the believer and draws a person to love God, obey God, so on and so forth, right? It elicits a worshipful, loving response, rather than, he would accuse the philosophers particularly, but also probably the later Ash'aris and the Mu'tazila, of basically rationalizing God, a concept of God, which becomes a philosophical abstraction, which is very difficult for the average person to relate to. Right. God is totally other. Okay, yes, he's totally other. Laysa kamithlihi shay wa huwa as-sami'ul basir, the Quran says. Allah says in the Quran, right? Nothing is like unto him, and he is the all-seeing, the all-hearing. So those two things have to somehow be kept. Well, don't humans see? Isn't it anthropomorphic to say that God sees? Can he see without eyes, and so on and so forth, right? So the idea is, how can you affirm this notion that God is completely other, ontologically speaking, right? Otherwise, he wouldn't be God if he's like creatures in any ontologically relevant sense. At the same time, if in our language about God, we kind of strip him of any kind of attributes, and and say, well, you can't affirm this, you can't affirm that, and you take the way of this via negativa, of negative theology. Well, we can't affirm anything about God because we only know corporeal things, we only know the created world. Our language is key to the created world. If we say anything about God, it's just already anthropomorphic, or there's already tashbih in it, assimilationism. So we can just say God is not this and not that and not that and not that, as the philosophers tend to do. You just a bunch of negations. And Ibn Taymiyyah says, well, okay, then how can you worship? I mean, this is a philosophical idea now, but how can I worship a completely negatively defined being? He's not inside the creation. He's not outside of it either. He's not here. He's not there. He's not this and that. On all different kinds of levels. Doesn't love, doesn't hate, but rather this. It for Ibn Taymiyyah, he would say, well, this now makes it very difficult to interact, to have a real kind of relationship with God. And because Muslims hold that the Quran is the word of God himself, I mean, it's not someone else's best guess or even the Prophet's words, peace be upon him, describing God as God's own description of himself. So, I mean, Ibn Taymiyyah would say, well, okay, why not describe God the way he describes himself and assume that he knows himself best and also how to speak about himself best in human language, and just kind of leave it at that. And again, try to come up with, I would say for him, again, a philosophical kind of model where he can preserve the reality of revelation, of the language of revelation, right? Yet answer, or try to answer, charges of tashbih, assimilationism, and tajsim, corporealism.
Right. So I think that's an excellent historical backdrop. And I think, so for those of you who are watching, I'm going to do something I've never done before, and that is to actually upload a presentation, or rather a photo, that you can actually find in Dr. Carl's book, which is this diagram here. So Dr. Carl, in light of what you said here, I'm just going to hopefully remove this. Is this clear for everybody? Yeah, I'm just hoping this is clear for everyone. So in light of what you've said here, so are you, according to this scheme, you have your, as you said, aql sarih, and then you have, naql sahih, and then below that you then have these. Is it correct to say that these are some kind of deviations from the norm or the absolute? Like, how does this diagram work? Because when I read your book, I thought this was a very interesting, summative pictorial of what's going on here.
Okay. Yeah, so I call this the Taymiyyah period, a pyramid. Right. I just made this up. So yes, for Ibn Taymiyyah, on the top of the pyramid, you have sound reason and authentic revelation. So al-aql al-sarih and naql al-sahih, both of them are testifying to one and the same truth. Okay, they're both saying the same thing. They don't contradict with each other, and this is revelation understood, authentic revelation understood in sort of a basically straightforward, plain language sense, and pure human reason that's not pre-committed to a bunch of dubious, ontological and other metaphysical premises. Okay, I mean, we can unpack that later, but that's what he means by aql sarih. Okay, it's sort of natural human reason that's shared by the run-of-the-mill as well as the elites. It's not a type of reason that's kind of restricted to a philosophical elite. Okay, and so these two, he says, are in perfect harmony with each other, and there's no ta'arud or no contradiction between them, and that's why the book is called Dar Ta'arud al-Aql wal-Naql, refutation or warding off of the contradiction between reason and revelation. Now he says, then you have groups that sort of move away from this kind of unified model, okay? And they do so by partly, on both sides, like partly misappropriating reason and bringing on assumptions and assuming that it's just reason per se, when actually it's not, okay? And you'll say like certain assumptions from like Greek metaphysics and so forth, that in the Middle Ages, people just, okay, well, this is just what reason says, quote unquote. He says, no. Those assumptions are parochial assumptions that the Greeks made, and I'm challenging those, right? So some assumptions are taken on, so the idea of reason gets sort of, deviates a little bit from the sarih reason, and at the same time, one's approach to scripture, in order to accommodate reason or this understanding of reason, one has to start reinterpreting scripture, right? And so from his perspective, you're falling away from the kind of full-fledged affirmationism of the plain sense of revelation, which he claims is was the kind of consensus position of the early community, which is normative. Okay, so the Ash'aris, for example, are not too bad. I mean, I know a lot of people think Ibn Taymiyyah Ash'aris, but if you look in the larger scheme of things, right, this is okay. A little bit like reason is a little bit off. There's some ta'wil going on with like a handful of attributes, and the more you go on, like the worse it gets. So maybe Ash'aris should be like, you can kind of do more of a tafsil here, and there's early and later. Then you go to the Mu'tazila, okay? And the Mu'tazila, their notion of reason is even further from actual aql sarih, and therefore their interpretation of scripture is even more extravagant, right? And their use of ta'wil is even more kind of indiscriminate. And then you go to the philosophers, and they're sort of the worst, right? I mean, they have a completely pre-committed and totally unnatural and highly contestable notion of reason, okay, which is front-loaded with a bunch of, very, from his perspective, very contentious premises taken from, again, Greek ontology, metaphysics, so forth, that he rejects. And at the same time, for them to accommodate the Quran, which they have to do as Muslims, or, belonging to the community of Muslims, all of Revelation becomes basically allegorical almost, right? Right. And so when you get to the bottom of the pyramid, right, on one side you have, on the left-hand side, pure, what he says, al-qarmata fi naqliyat, pure allegorization. I mean, all of scripture practically becomes one huge allegory. Nothing really means what it seems to mean in the plain language, what you would think just by reading it. And at the same time, on the rational side, because you're so far away from true reason, right? What's the opposite of reason? Sophistry. You just fall into, basically a sophistical, use of reason. Okay, and so are the philosophers all the way down there? I mean, again, this is just approximate, but that's kind of how he sees, the progression.
Right. Okay. Right. So I think that was a very, very useful summary. I think many of our viewers definitely appreciate that. But would you mind discussing how Ibn Taymiyyah addresses the question of divine attributes? So this is your chapter 6.
I was trying to get away from this.
So
no,
because I think now that you've given us the theoretical framework, I think just to kind of see it in action would be really good.
Okay. Well, this takes us back to some of the points that we were discussing earlier. I mean, away from this kind of epistemic framework with the chart and all of that in the table. Yeah. This takes us back to, and I'll have to introduce a few new concepts here, but I'll try to do it, briefly and comprehensively, if not comprehensively. Okay. Basically, so if we take this idea of Again, I mentioned some of the most contentious points. Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa, the All-Merciful has settled upon the throne. Yadullahi, God's hand, and so forth. Okay, these attributes which seem to be anthropomorphic or imply the possession of a body, which most theologians are keen to sort of say that God is not a body for various reasons. Okay, so Ibn Taymiyyah would say, as I said before, so I don't have a chart for this, unfortunately, but we need to go back to all right, so the mainstream tradition, when it comes to language, understanding language, makes a difference between what is called haqiqa and majaz. Haqiqa, you could translate into English as the literal sense or the proper sense or the plain sense, zahir, something like that, okay? And majaz is the, literally transgressive sense, the sense that goes beyond, so sort of a figurative sense. Metaphor is sort of a subset of that, but figurative is probably the best generic term for majaz. Okay, so you have a literal versus metaphorical use of language. Okay, the common, I think actually Dr. Hoover gave this example yesterday. You say asad, which is a lion, right? Usually you'll think of the feline, the cat, the lion, right? And that is taken to be the literal meaning of the word. And if I say so-and-so man is such a lion, was such a lion in that battle, well, you know that I don't mean to say that he turned into a female cat and actually went out and scratched his enemies to death. You mean that he possesses the courage and the forthrightness and the strength of a lion, and therefore I'm using it metaphorically, okay? Another example to come to closer to the divine attributes, right? The word hand. When I say hand, if you ask most people, well, what does that mean literally? What is a hand literally? Everyone will say, well, it's this, right? So yeah, that's a hand. Okay, so I say a 5-fingered flabby appendage, like fleshy appendage at the end of a human arm or an animal arm. That's a hand. Okay, all right. Are there non-literal usages of the word hand? Of course there are. And in English, probably any language. Most languages, body parts give rise to lots of metaphorical usages and idiomatic expressions. It's as true in Arabic as it is in English, and probably any language. So I say in English, and I point this out in chapter 4. Can you give me a hand with the dishes, right? What does that mean? What does it mean here? Everyone understands, you don't even have to think about it. Everyone understands that I'm asking for help. If you were to cut off your hand, literally cut it off and give it to me, well, you asked for a hand, here you go. I would say, well, no, this is not acceptable. You simply don't understand the English language. And you cannot blame me for being indirect or unclear or, Sharif didn't use language clearly, right? He confused his interlocutor. The interlocutor is incompetent, okay? Contextually speaking, we use that to mean help. Or I say, oh, he had a hand in this. Well, what does that mean? Okay, complicity, collusion, fault, right? Doesn't mean that the person was sitting there, with the hand in there, okay? What about in the Quran, right? We read, ولا تكن يدك مغلولة إلى ولا تجعل يدك مغلولة إلى عنقك ولا تبسطها كل البسط فتقعد ملوما محسورا. Right? Don't tie your hand up or make your hand chained up to your neck, nor stretch it out completely كل البسط, right? Such that you would then be forlorn and without provisions and so forth. Okay, what does this mean? Don't be tight-fisted. That's also metaphorical in English. Tight-fisted means niggardly, miserly, bakhil. It was stingy. Okay,
stingy,
every day, stingy. Okay, don't stretch it all out, meaning spending in a profligate manner, such that everything you gain, you're spending, and then you're a mendicant yourself. You have nothing, you have to go beg because you gave everything away, right? But give generously, but not with your hand completely stretched out, okay? Nobody reading the Quran could possibly think that God means literally don't walk around with your hand chained to your neck, nor walk around with your hands sticking out in front of your bodies the whole time. No one would understand that. Everyone understands that this is a metaphorical usage of the word hand to mean don't be stingy and don't be so profligate in your generosity that you end up, needy yourself, okay? So now let's take this back to the mainstream, I'll call it the mainstream tradition. the Falasifa, the Mutakallimun here, so the theologians, Ash'aris and others, right? They would say, okay, so when it comes to hand, the literal meaning of hand is this. That's the haqiqa meaning, okay? If you use hand to mean complicity, to mean help, to mean anything else, right? Then that is a metaphorical sense. You're not using it literally, you're using it metaphorically. If you say this soldier was a lion in that battle, you're using the word lion metaphorically, okay? Yeah. And so on and so forth. Ibn Taymiyyah would say, no. This is not how language works, okay? Because what you're doing is you're assuming that words have a primary sort of proper sense, to go beyond which is to then take you into the realm of majaz or metaphor. And he says, actually, this presupposes a model of language, which assumes, and if you know, I mean, people know the wada' al-lugha, and that this word is mawdu' for this meaning, i.e. coined for the meaning, right? As if there's some point in time in which a meaning is kind of like assigned to a vocable, right? Like a lafz, a word, right? A meaning is assigned to it, and the word is meant only to signify that, and then later on, other meanings get added, and those transgress. They transgress the original coinage of it, right? That's the model of kind of language and semantics that the traditional understanding of haqiqa versus majaz presupposes. Ibn Taymiyyah says no. Again, he looks at says your assumptions about the way language works are wrong. That's not how it works. Language is always contextual, right? There's no such thing as abstract language. When human beings speak, they speak in real life situations. This is a pragmatic approach to language. So he says, when I say hand, if I just write it up on a chalkboard, right, you can't actually know what is meant by that outside of an actual speech situation, right? And then you are judging contextually what is meant by hand in that circumstance. So if I just write hand up on the board and say, what's the meaning? I just have to shrug my shoulders and say, well, maybe the first thing that comes to my mind is this, but that's only because it happens to be the case statistically that we most often use the word in the language hand. We use the word hand in the language to mean this. Okay, but that's just statistical. That doesn't mean that that's the proper sense of the word. I mean, That would be his argument, okay? He would say, in every case, including where this is meant, you can only determine that by the context, okay? It's only when I say, go wash your hands before dinner, that you know in this context that I'm talking about this. Because right before when I said, give me a hand, or right after, give me a hand with the dishes, I'm using the same word, but it's only in context that you know that I mean it, quote unquote, metaphorically. So I say this whole haqiqa majaz, that's not a meaningful distinction. All language is contextual. Now, what he says is interesting, that every meaning is proper in its own context. Every meaning is haqiqa in its own context. So if I say, go wash your hands before dinner, then the haqiqa meaning of hand is this, in that context as determined by that context. If I say, give me a hand with the dishes, then he's not a literalist in the sense that, hand can only mean this. He'll say, in that context, in the English language, give me a hand with the dishes can only mean help, aoun, musa'ada, whatever. That's all it can mean. And so that is the haqiqa meaning in that context. The haqiqa meaning of the word yad in that context means help, okay? She had a hand in this. The haqiqa meaning is collusion. It's not this. It's not a metaphor here. That is the proper sense intended in the context by the speaker, okay? What does this have to do with the, divine? I'm sorry, I tried to do this.
No, this is very good. This is very good.
Anyway, it's being recorded. People can stop the recording, take a break, and come back. So I'm fine. All right. So
I forgot to ask you, sorry, how are you doing? Are you coping okay?
Fine. Yeah, I'm fine.
All right, alhamdulillah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's one side. Put that aside for now. That's one set of considerations. His pragmatic use of the way. Now you can respond to this, and I mean, you can sort of say, well, is he just playing with words here? And I mean, even if I assume haqiqa and majaz, I mean, it's also, I mean, from the quote unquote mainstream or traditional perspective, I mean, it's only in context that I can know whether you mean my physical hand or something else, right? But the mainstream would say, okay, but if you mean this hand, then you're using it in the proper sense. Otherwise, it's majaz. And Ibn Taymiyyah says, no, I'm calling them all haqiqa, but I admit that it's contextually determined. And of course, the mainstream position doesn't deny the relevance of context because it understands. I mean, everyone who speaks any language understands that language is not And you can't be a literalist in the sort of caricatured sense that people think of it. I mean, it's not, language simply doesn't work that way. And no one assumes that it does, because it doesn't. Do you see what I'm saying? All right, so that's one. Now, what is he trying to say? So when he says the relevant distinction is not haqiqa majaz, the relevant distinction is haqiqa. Now, we just talked about haqiqa as a semantic category, about the meaning of a word, okay? He talks about something totally different now. Put that on the side, we'll come back to it, but put it to the side. He says the relevant distinction is not haqiqa and majaz, because from a semantic perspective, every meaning is haqiqa as determined by the context. So there's no majaz in language, okay? Which again doesn't mean that he's a literalist in the sense understood by the mainstream. Doesn't mean
the definition.
It doesn't mean that he thinks that the word is always haqiqa according to the mainstream tradition, because the mainstream tradition, the haqiqa meaning is only one meaning, and it's the most common one, right? So he's not saying that. He's saying, yeah, hand means, and yed means a bunch of different things, but each sense is haqiqa in its particular context when it's actually used. And there's no such thing as abstract meaning. There's no such thing as abstract language. That's a abstraction of the mind. Again, if I write the word H-A-N-D or ya, dal in Arabic on the board, and you say, well, what does it mean? I'll say, well, it could mean these 8 different things, right? Given the conventions of the English language or the Arabic, it could mean 8 different things, right? And I can't tell you until you put it in a context and use it. Then I can tell you, okay, in this context, it means this. But just up on the board in isolation, I can't tell you. You look up the word hand in the dictionary, it's the same thing. It's just going to give you a list of possible meanings. How do you know which one's used? Look at the context. Look at the language pragmatically as it's used, okay? Now, how is this relevant to, okay, he'll say now we have to go to ontology, right? From like, okay, when it comes to something like sifat, okay? Notice I said for him there's no abstract language, there's only real existing language used in the world, okay? This is a common theme in his thought. Because now when I come to the level of ontology, when I talk about God's attributes, this is an ontological question, right? Does God ontologically possess a hand or not, right? Does he settle on the throne or not, okay? And if he does possess a hand or settle, what's the nature of this? Is there a meaningful way that settling could happen that's not anthropomorphic for me as a human? Is there a meaningful way that I can ascribe a hand to God haqiqatan, right? That's not also committing me to corporealism, tajseem, okay? So these are ontological questions, okay?
Right.
Theological in the larger sense, but they're ontological, right? In the more proper sense, more, okay. So he will say something similar that, okay, what he understands the mainstream tradition as what he thinks is leading to the discomfort with affirming certain of these corporeal sounding attributes, right, is that he says there is an assumption that things have an essence, okay? This goes back to, I know yesterday you spoke with Dr. Hoover about nominalism, right,
yeah.
versus like a realism. Ibn Taymiyyah, by the way, I mean, it's said, oh, he's a nominalist. I mean, there are different positions. There's like hard nominalism, there's hard realism, there's like soft realism and all. And he's actually, in some cases, he's more of a nominalist. In other cases, he's actually a moderate realist. And actually, Anke von Kugeligen points this out, and I think she's correct. And it's in a footnote in chapter 5, a quote from her, I think in the text and the footnote, where she gives this whole list of things where he's actually a realist, a moderate realist. So he's not a nominalist all across the board, right? So anyway, if people are not familiar what nominalism, realism even are, it doesn't matter right now, you can go look it up. But Ibn Taymiyyah is a qualified nominalist in some senses, okay? And for people for whom nominalism is like the devil, well, okay, he's not complete, he's a nominalist somewhat in some senses, but he's a realist in others. So, again, there's more nuance than this, kind of everyday sort of understandings or stereotypes would have us believe. Okay, when it comes to entities, so he will say that what is a human being, all right? The mainstream tradition, and this is influenced by Greek, philosophy, right? Because this was the going dominant, language that was being used in the categories and assumptions, that every human being is human by virtue of possessing a particular nature, okay, a particular essence, which you could call it the mahiyya, the quiddity, right? You could also refer to it as the kind of the haqiqa of the thing, okay? So there is humanness, or al-insaniya, right? Insan is a human being, man, right? So insaniya, there's humanness, human beingness, okay? Now, according to the Platonic model, Plato, right? As everyone knows, the Platonic forms, the essence actually precedes and pre-exists the instantiations of it. So out in the world of the forms, there is the ideal table. There is the form of the table, essence. There's a form of the human being, the essence of the human being, the essence of whatever. And then every individual instantiated human being is just a physical instantiation in physical terms of that ideal essence, which exists separate from the physical existing objects, or it's members of the class, if you want to put it in that, of the species, okay? On the Aristotelian model, the Aristotelian model says, no, you don't have this insania just flowing in. Aristotle rejected this notion of his own teacher, of Plato's forms, okay? He says, no, there isn't this pre-existing insania out there, right, that human beings are reflecting. Rather, but nevertheless, there is some type of essential humanness that all human beings participate in ontologically. So there's an ishtirak going on here, okay? Ishtirak fil wujud. So all human beings, all 7 billion of us, right? We somehow all participate ontologically in some meaningful way in this human essence that we all share. But the essence is something real that we all participate in, okay? Now, Ibn Taymiyyah said, so this is a realist construal of universals and of essences, okay? So what is a human being? Give me a universal, that's a universal category. As insan, we have a bunch of different instantiations of it, currently about 7 billion, okay, currently live, right? But they're all instantiations of this universal. Ibn Taymiyyah will say, so if you're a realist, you will say there really is a human essence, either in the Platonic or the Aristotelian construal of it, okay? Ibn Taymiyyah rejects both of these and says there is no essence that exists ontologically. There is no ontologically existent essence, okay? What do I mean by that, right? What exists is you and I and he and she and they, and go on and on for all 7 billion. You have individual instantiations of individual human beings, okay? All right? What happens now is the mind, our mind, the mind is important for it. Our mind looks out on all these human beings and it abstracts qualities which are common to all of them, okay? And it abstracts those into a understanding of what, generally speaking, qualities one must have in order to be a human being, to belong to the class or to the species, to the knower, okay? But the essence that is spoken of by the philosophers and presumed also by the mutakallimun in general, for him is not, it does not exist in reality. It's a mental construct. And again, I don't mean that mental construct in a postmodern kind of, or in a derogatory sense, but it's a mental abstraction. And it's useful because it allows our mind to understand reality and categorize it and deal with it. But the essence itself exists here. Fil adhan, laysa fil a'yan. Okay, this is one of his, again, dichotomies, that there's that which exists fil a'yan, out in the kind of existing objects, or exists as a existent object, okay? And then there's that which exists fil adhan. And for him, the essences are mental, they're mental existence, ENTS, okay? They don't have any ontological reality outside of the mind. Now, why is this important for him? This is important for him because he says no two existing entities, okay? He uses the word ayn, like an existing thing, an entity. Ayn qa'ima bidhatiha, a sort of self-existing, doesn't mean like not contingent on God, but he just means like I'm an ayn qa'ima bidhatiha, meaning I'm a sort of a cohesive, entity that exists as a separate thing from other entities. Do you see what I'm saying? Doesn't mean I'm not contingent on God, for example. It doesn't mean qa'ima in the sense that God is qayyum or something. It doesn't mean that, right? Self-sufficient, but it just means a separate kind of existing entity. Right. So he says what exists are just a bunch of different entities. Okay, entities of the same species have a lot of common features together, but they don't ontologically share in anything with any other entity. There's nothing that you and I, Shuaib, as human beings, you're an insan, I'm an insan. There's nothing that you and I share in ontologically. You're qa'im bidhatika and I'm qa'im bidhati or binafsi, right? I'm a self-standing kind of, entity that exists, and you're also one. Now we belong to the same class, but our subsumption under the class is recognized by the mind, but you and I don't share in, there's nothing out there, right? Certainly not a Platonic form, but not even an Aristotelian kind of essence that you and I somehow nashtariku fihi, like we're participating in it. He said that doesn't exist. So you and I, yeah.
So Dr. Sharif, if with that logic, then would it be correct to say that there's a possibility that I'm a Homo sapien, but you're not, and vice versa?
No.
I'm just kidding. That was meant to be a bad joke. Go ahead, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. All right. So this is all right. So why does he say this, or what work is he trying to get out of this? Okay. He's saying there are no two entities that share in anything ontologically speaking. Okay. So if you have certain qualities and I have certain qualities, okay, human beings have hands, rabbits have hands, and other things have hands or whatever. Okay. The nature of what the hand actually is, right? There's no universal hand, even if it's understood as a physical object at the end of an arm type of thing, right? Even in that sense, forget about metaphorical use. Even in that sense, there's no essence of a hand that's kind of out there that all these hands participate in. A human hand, an animal hand, a robot hand, right? So what does he want to say? Like, okay, so if you affirm a hand of God, right, and you're assuming that there's sort of that a haqiqa, a hand haqiqatan, if you want to affirm a hand of God literally, quote unquote, right? Okay, if you're assuming that, wait a minute, there's an essence to the hand, and all of the hands that we know, human hands and animal hands, all these hands, they all participate in that essence, okay? And then you define the essence, and part of that definition will be corporealism, because human hands are bodies, and animal hands are bodies, and robot hands, all the hands we know are bodies, okay? And then you want to say God has a hand, haqiqatan. Now you've subsumed God's hand under that essence, okay? What he wanted to say, no, there is no essence. That's just a figment of your imagination. It's an abstraction of the mind, okay? Everything that has a hand that is proper to it, based on its own haqiqah. And what he means by haqiqah here is not the meaning, literal versus figurative, but haqiqah means haqiqatu ash-shay fi dhatihi, like it's the ontological reality of how a thing exists in the world. You're a human being, you have a hand. The type of hand you have is conditioned by your overall haqiqah as a type of being that has a body and whose body is disaggregable. I can, cut it up. La qadarullah. Or it's subject to demise and so on and so forth, okay? A rabbit might have a hand that shares some of those features but doesn't share others. A robot might have, again, features of a hand that share some of those but not others, right? Everything has something that's proper to it as defined by its own haqiqah. So what he wants to say is that, okay, if there's no essential sharing even between you and me as two human beings, right? Okay, let alone between me and an animal, right? Other than a human being. I mean, humans are animals, but other species of animals. Or me and a robot, which is a kind of machine imitation of a human being, okay? Right? If there's no essential sharing, right, ishtirak in anything real, ontologically, between even us as created beings, right, then that's a fortiori, and even more so the case between us and God, the creator of the universe, who, alladhi laysa kamithlihi shay', right? There is none like unto him whatsoever. So what he wants to say here is, so if I say God has a hand, haqiqatan, okay? And I don't mean it in the sense of like abstract sense of help and generosity, but I mean it in the sense that for us as human beings would be referring to this, okay? Right? If I were to say that God has a hand haqiqatan, I'm saying that God has some type of hand in reality, okay? But because there is no essence, of hands, I mean, there is no essential hand, right? That whatever hand it is that God has is something that is unique to him according to his own haqiqah, right? His own existential reality as a ayn qa'ima bidatiha. I mean, God too is a self-subsistent kind of existing entity. Of course, he's totally unlike any other and has many features that no other entity has that make him God, okay? Including the fact of being, having always existed, being indestructible, being indivisible, being completely free of need, being self-sustaining and not contingent on anything else. All of these things are what make God God and what make us not God, because, we have the opposite of all that. We're contingent, right. We come into being, we die, all of these other features, right? We're deficient, he's perfect, okay? So these are the qualities that distinguish God, in his essential godness, if you want to put it that way, divinity, versus created beings, okay? It's not the fact that he has or doesn't have a hand, okay? Because if you say he has a hand, because he said he has a hand, or he referred to his hand, yadullahi fawqa aydihim, God's hand is above, or even more explicitly, yadahu mabsutatan, his two hands are outstretched, right? Ibn Taymiyyah, God spoke of himself as having hands, so we can't deny that. But what we do know is that the hands of God, right, don't share anything essentially with our hands, because my hand doesn't even share anything essentially with yours, essentially.
Right.
Okay, my hand and your hand are similar because I'm a human being, you're a human being, right? But God's not a human being, so whatever his hand is, it's not going to be comparable in any ontologically relevant way to my hand. By ontologically relevant, I mean in any way that would compromise his divinity, by introducing into it contingency, okay, the ability to be taken apart or disaggregated, right? The ability to, the fact of having come into being, or the fact of, being subject to demise and all of that. None of that would be, because God's being is such, right? Eternal, indestructible, so on and so forth. So anything about him, right? Just like anything about me is going to be colored by my haqiqah of as a human being, my ontological reality as a human being, a created entity of a particular class. And anything about God, including if we say he has a hand and he settles upon the throne, or any of these other, contested sort of attributes, he will say, no, there is no, again, what you're thinking of the essence of the hand, which you don't want to attribute to God, that essence is just an abstraction of your mind. And you're abstracting it from an empirical reality that is a created reality. And so your conception of a hand is going to be colored by corporealism and colored by limitation and all of these things that we know to be features of our empirical world, right? That's what our minds have been working with. And when they abstract some abstract notion of a hand in some kind of essence, again, which is just an abstraction of our mind, they're abstracting it from empirical reality, which is contingent and created and, transient, yeah, thank you. Okay. So it's true that our everyday notion of a hand will be colored by all these things. But because we know that God doesn't have any of those qualities, okay, his hand, whatever its haqiqah might be, right, whatever its reality might be, is by definition not going to incorporate any of those deficiencies on the basis of which we and the theologians and the philosophers, are resistant to the idea of attributing a hand to God. They don't want to attribute a hand to God because they don't want to attribute deficiency to God, okay? I mean, phrased as not wanting to attribute a body, but it's because a body is seen as being something that's deficient. A body is something that's limited. Again, you can cut it apart. Body has a bunch of deficiencies, right? So the desire not to attribute a body to God is a desire not to attribute deficiency to God, and the understanding that bodies, at least bodies that we know, are kind of shot through with a bunch of deficiencies. Right. But his idea is that God doesn't have any of those deficiencies. And so if he has a hand, again, so what he says is the distinction is not haqiqa majaz, it's haqiqa versus ma'na. Okay? Ma'na is the meaning, it's the notion. So he says that we know from our ambient reality that we live in, we know the meaning of a hand. Now this gets a little bit, subtle, and I'm not quite sure that it works, but I'm just going to give you what his argument is. Okay? We know what the meaning of a hand is. Okay? But the haqiqah of it, the ontological reality, that's going to be determined by the kind of entity that's possessing the hand. Okay? So what you know of the deficiencies of my human hand is derivative of what you know about my haqiqah, my ontological reality as a human being. Okay? When it comes to affirming something of an unseen reality, such as God, who is not seen by human beings in this life, so he's in the ghaib, he's in the unseen for us. Okay? When it comes to attributing a hand or anything, or settling on the throne to God, an unseen reality, okay, we understand the meaning of it. So he's trying to preserve the meaning of revelation, right? The directness of it, the fact that, okay, you don't have to hear it and then stop and run to the theologian and say, well, what does it actually mean? Okay, the meaning of it's clear, the meaning is affirmed, okay, but the haqiqah of it, the haqiqah is different. How does this apply to God? And this goes back to the quote, this is his philosophical elaboration, if you will, of the quote attributed to Imam Malik, that al-istiwa'u ma'lum, settling, which Ibn Taymiyyah says means that the meaning of settling is known. Wal kayfu majhul, but it's the how of it, the modality, that is unknown. So Ibn Taymiyyah is this is his philosophical model to try to account for that. So if I say Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arsh istawa, the All-Merciful has settled upon the throne, my mind knows what that means. And I don't deny that meaning of God. And I say istawa haqiqa, istiwa'an haqiqiyan, right? Istawa haqiqatan, he actually istawa in a real sense, okay? But what is the haqiqa? Sorry, I affirm the meaning, I affirm the ma'na of it, okay? Uthbitu dhalik al-ma'na lillah. That's what he would say. I'm affirming that meaning of God. What is the haqiqa of God's istiwa, right? What is the ontological reality? Hada majhul, wal kayfu majhul. I don't know that because I do not know God's actual reality. I don't know his the kun, that Allah. I don't know the actual nature of God's essential being. Right. The Prophet told his companions, you can't know the kun, all right? Kaf nun ha kun. That's the kind of essential reality. You can't know that. If we could know it, then God would not be God. If we could comprehend him with our minds, which are limited, then he's not. Then he's limited, right? So we can't actually know. So there's some element of negative theology in the sense that we can't know the actual reality of God's essential nature. But Ibn Taymiyyah says, well, we don't have to know that. We know enough about it that it's perfect, indestructible, all of these other qualities I've mentioned. That's sufficient for us to know. At the same time, we have all of these other positive attributes that God has affirmed of himself in Revelation, which make for a very rich picture of rich image. I don't even want to say picture, but allow us to know God in a rather detailed way, right? This attribute, that 99 names, even more if you put them all from the Quran and Hadith, right? Most of those are abstract, merciful and kind and compassionate, and the creator and the one who gives life and death and so on and so forth, right? Most of those are abstract, okay? But some of them sort of seem to correspond to what in us as human beings would be a physical attribute, like a hand or like movement. All of those, he just says, there's really no non-arbitrary place to draw the line, okay? And we saw that also when later Ash'ari say, well, okay, God can't love and hate. Well, love and hate those are not physical qualities. Those are abstract. Those are ma'ani, right? Hubb is a ma'na. Love is a notion, right? But some later Ash'ari will say, no, but even that we don't want to affirm because that would be anthropomorphic. Yeah. So that's where he gets nervous and says, wait a minute. So it's not even a question of physical body, corporeal versus incorporeal. No one says that love is corporeal or hate is corporeal. These are ma'ani, these are notions. But still, if you really start in his view, taking this kind of thinking to its logical conclusion, right? You can turn around and anything can be, okay, humans exist and God exists. Oh, you've attributed the same attribute, the same predicate to humans and to God, and you've subsumed them under. If there's wujud has an essence, right? Now you're saying God and human beings, yashtarikani fi, musamma al-wujud. That's how we would say it. They're partaking, they're co-sharing in some common wujud. Now you've made tashbih of God. Humans exist, God exists. Well, that's tashbih. You've just assimilated one to the other. You've said God is like humans in some respect, right? Because if he exists and they exist, well, then they're alike in some respect. And doesn't the Quran say, "Laysa kamithlihi shay"? There's nothing like unto him whatsoever. Well, there you go. And then he'll say, okay, fine. Then you get to like the Batinis, what he calls the Batinis, sort of like Ismaili sect, which would end up saying just that. And it's in the chapter 2. We don't say God exists, nor do we say that he's not. We don't say God is existent, nor do we say he's non-existent, nor do we say he's not existent, nor do we say he's not non-existent. Right? We just don't say anything. And Ibn Taymiyyah says, well, this is nonsense. I mean, so then what are you worshiping? Right? And that's not the Quran didn't come with that. And if it had, the whole thing would have been a failure from day one. Because who can worship? I mean, who can even understand theoretically what that means, let alone relate to that, an entity described in those terms as a living God whom I'm supposed to love and worship and fear and so forth. Right? Yeah. So for him, again, there's no non-arbitrary place. So he just wants to say, affirm all of them, right? Affirm the ma'ani, al-ma'na ma'lum, okay? The haqiqah of it, we don't know. There is no actual existing, like essence that exists out there that anything's partaking in. Even again, us as human beings, we're not partaking in anything ontologically with each other, right? So that's even more the case with God. So affirm a hand, affirm the istiwa on the throne, the settling on the throne, and just kind of tatabarra, you just wash your hands of the whole thing by saying, look, however these things apply to God, they apply in a manner that is commensurate with his haqiqah, which is his, the reality, the existential reality of his ontological existence.
Right.
Which we can't actually know the full core essence of the kun of it, because we're he's God and we're not, and we're too limited.
Right. So
that's kind of where that's sort of how he tries to solve this issue. He wants to be a full-fledged affirmationist, a muthbit, which again he claims all of the early community was, the companions, the Sahaba in the first 3 generations. That's the Salaf for him, right? The first 3 generations, so the companions, the successors, and the successors of the successors, the Sahaba, the Tabi'in, and the Tabi'in. Okay, his contention is that all of them were full-fledged affirmationists, including Imam Malik, according to this quote. Okay, and that you don't start getting people questioning this stuff until later, because of philosophical developments and importation of Greek ideologies and all of these assumptions which are taken on board, which he thinks are specious. Okay, and so he wants to maintain that position while at the same time responding to the charge of, okay, because this would be the Ash'ari charge, the later Ash'ari charge. Well, if you say a hand's not like our hand, well, that's meaningless. I don't know any hand but this hand. And if you say God has a hand, the ma'na is ma'lum, well, what do you mean the ma'na is known? I mean, as a notion, I can only think of this. So God either has something that's kind of like this or he doesn't. And if he does, that kind of is very close to corporealism. If he doesn't, then either the verse has no meaning or it must mean something metaphorical, abstract, help or generosity or something like that. So he wants to answer that charge of corporealism by sort of elaborating a philosophical model in which you could affirm a common meaning between various entities in the seen realm, like created human beings, or beings that are in the seen realm and the unseen realm, right? Including other created beings in the unseen, like angels. And I say this in chapter 6. We see, angels see, S-E-E, okay? We know what it means to see. It means to have cognition, visual cognition of something existing, okay? Now, I know something about the modality of humans seeing because I am a human and I experience that and I see other people, seeing, okay? I don't know what it means for an angel to see because angels exist in the unseen realm. I don't actually know their haqiqah. I don't know the reality of their ontological existence. I don't know it because I don't have any empirical experience of it, okay? So my language and my concepts are key to my empirical experience. But when you say the angels see you, or Shaitan and his minions see you from where you do not see them, as it says in the Quran, right? I don't know how they see. I don't know if they have organs. I don't know if it works with light the way it does with us. Okay, I have no idea. But I know what it means for them to see, that they have visual cognizance of things. And when Allah is described, God is described as being basir in the Quran, right? And that he yara wa yubsir, he sees. Okay, absir bihi wa asma', how seeing and hearing is he, Okay, I don't know how he sees, right? He doesn't need to have organs like I don't, but I do know that he sees, meaning that he has some like cognizance of the way things look. I mean, however you want to put it. He's not ignorant of, how I look sitting here and you look and all of this, the tree outside my window. He sees these things. How does he do it? I don't know. But the meaning of it, when I say that God sees, I understand the meaning of this and I affirm the meaning of it. As for the kayf of it, the haqiqa of it, this is the haqiqa ma'na. We affirm the ma'na, the meaning, and we do tawaqquf on the haqiqa of it. We affirm the meaning. As for how does God see? God knows best. He sees in a way that is most, that is befitting his haqiqa, his ontological reality, which we can't really know much of because we don't have any empirical experience of it, right? But we don't deny that he sees. And so I think most people wouldn't have a problem with that. I mean, yeah, sure, God sees, God hears, God knows, not a problem, because we're able to kind of think of these things as more abstract. But when to say, okay, God has a hand and he descends into the lower heaven at night, every night in the last third of the night, as per the hadith, or he settles on the throne. Here, this gets more uncomfortable because these are like overtly physical things. And it's harder for us to kind of, we can affirm the meaning, but then it becomes harder to kind of abstract the meaning from a haqiqa, right, an ontological reality, which is very tightly bound to corporealism. Yeah. But for him, he said, okay, that's our problem, and it's just that's the limitation of our own kind of imagination, because again, it's key to our empirical reality. Yeah. And for us, certain of these movements and physical features, like a body part, these are obviously for us, these are corporeal. I mean, they are manifested in a corporeal sense for us. So yes, we might jump to that, right? And Ibn Taymiyyah, I don't think would want you to jump to that, because he does, of course, believe laysa kamithlihi shay. There is nothing like unto God. So I think he would say, I mean, this is kind of my interpretation of it. I think he would say, we therefore, it might be harder for us to kind of distance the meaning of a hand or settling on the throne from corporealism, but that's kind of due to the limitation of our minds, which is key to our empirical experience of the world, which the contents of our mind are basically an abstraction of to begin with. Okay, but nevertheless, we should affirm of God what he has affirmed of himself, and as he says the early community did, while simultaneously understanding that just like any of the other attributes, including love and hate, which again later schools of thought will also kind of be uncomfortable with those, right? He'll just say there is no, again, non-arbitrary point of distinction, and it's not really a question of corporealism if you're going to start denying love and hate in rida and things like this, good pleasure and so forth. So he says, look, if you concede the premise, then you're actually doing tashbih. It's the people who are denying these who are doing tashbih, because they assume that if God has any of these qualities, he can only possess them in the way that a human being does, and that's why you're denying of it. Because love means this for a human being, some type of shauq of the, like whatever the kind of, formal definition of it is, right? Or bughd is sort of, this kind of, connected to human deficiencies and needs and wants and trying to fulfill needs and all of that, right? He will say, okay, you guys, whether it's Ash'aris or, philosophers or whatever, you guys are the ones who are actually being anthropomorphist, because you're insisting, you say this is what love means for a human, and therefore God can't love. And you say, well, wait a minute, yeah, that's what love means for a human, but who said God was a human? I mean, you're the ones assuming that, and then denying the love because you assume that he can only love the way you love, or that love for him can only mean what, sort of have the ontological reality that it has for us as human beings. Right. Even if that analysis of love is correct anyway. I mean, I think that definition is kind of weird, but he would, again, definitions, he has a problem with definitions. I mean, we can't get into that now, obviously, right? Right. But he would say, we know what it means to love, right? And when you read the Quran, you hear Allah loves and Allah doesn't love or whatever. everybody kind of understands that plain sense language. Everyone's heart is filled with, a certain mana, okay? God loves, well, I want to be among those people that he loves, right? I want to be doing the things that he loves. God doesn't love, la yuhibbu, okay, well, wow, I don't want to be, everyone understands what it means for God to love and not love, right? We don't need to know the modality of it.
Yeah.
And it's only when you start digging into the modality, and then you can only do so in human terms because you're a human being, you're limited, then you're going to say, well, wait a minute, we can't affirm this meaning of God, this haqiqah of it. And so then you start saying God doesn't love. And Ibn Taymiyyah says, okay, now you're like turning off the language of revelation, okay? And you're divesting it of meaning, okay? And then why would God have used those words if he didn't mean them? And then what is the average person supposed to understand when you start coming and saying, okay, God doesn't love and hate? Well then, but he says, yuhibbuna yuhibbunahu. And now you're telling me he doesn't mean that. So now my confidence in revelation is decreased, right? I can't read it and with any confidence I'm actually understanding what's intended by it. Do you see what I'm saying? And then what does it mean to tell someone God doesn't love? I mean, I thought God loves me. Or, I'm trying to act such that God would love me. And you're saying, well, God can't love. Well, thank you very much. I mean, Ibn Taymiyyah will say, well, okay, you've just kind of destroyed like a fundamental feature of the relationship between God and man that God has intended to establish by informing us as human beings that he does love and not love, and what can we do to be on one side or the other. So for him, as Dr. Hoover pointed out yesterday, there's a very real kind of, revelation came with a purpose to draw us to God, to make it, bring us to belief in God, love of God, worship of God, right? And to know God, right? إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ إِلَّا لِيَعْرِفُونَ. I did not create jinn and mankind except to know me, i.e. to worship me, i.e. to know me. Well, you can only worship and love something if you know it, at least enough, okay? So Ibn Taymiyyah, it's and I guess we'll have to end here, it's crucial to preserve the reality of the language that, again, from a Muslim perspective, God himself has used, right? It's not someone else's, well, I was thinking and I was inspired and this is what I think. This is God himself describing himself. So for Ibn Taymiyyah, we have to be very careful about kind of dismantling or qualifying or hemming in or sort of, again, turning off essentially this language. We need to keep it open and alive and real, and we need to be in a place where we can affirm it in its most naturally understood sense, okay? While at the same time responding to the reasonable objection that, wait a minute, we don't want to anthropomorphize God. Because he does say, Laysa kamithlihi shay', and he's not a human being, and he's not deficient, and he's not this and that. And we don't want to have a image of God, because also that's not a God you would want to worship either. Like the Greek gods or something, they're just superhumans, like Übermenschen or something like that, right? I mean, Zeus and Aphrodite and all of these, they're just like superhumans with superpowers, right? I mean, they're obviously like, drawn in statues and images and stuff like that. So it's kind of crassly anthropomorphic, right? But then, okay, that's not really a God that the Quran, that's not what the Quran is also calling people to worship either, just these kind of glorified human beings, right? So for Ibn Taymiyyah, that's not obviously what he's calling for, right? But he wants to call for the reality of the language of revelation such that we can respond in the proper way and that we can enter into the proper relationship with God through his word and come to know him through his own description of himself and react to him accordingly with the proper love, fear, hope, desire, modesty, humility, subservience, submission, all of these other qualities that we're supposed to have. Right?
So, all right.
There's always more that can be said, but that's kind of the shtick, right? That's that's like the in a nutshell what his project is. And I'll stop there. If you have any more questions,
Right. So first of all, thank you so much. I think that was a really elaborate explanation of what is otherwise a very tricky slope. It's very difficult.
It's a 10-volume work, so I think a few hours is not a raw deal.
Yeah, I can imagine. But there's a lot of questions here, and I think it's because we've already taken 2.5 hours of your time. What I want to do is I want to just maybe throw out. So guys, you can easily access Dr. Sharif's academia. We've posted up there. We've even posted his book down there in the description box, so you can download his book anytime you want. But
Yeah,
Dr. Sharif,
by the way, the book is open access.
yeah, it's
So
open access.
the
Yeah,
full text is available online. You can download it, print it out, you can save it, you can share it. If you want to buy a hard copy, it's $139 US, 119 euros. Be my guest. I mean, I'm not making money off of it, but I'm just saying, their Sharif actually. There is a possibility that they will be releasing a soft cover version, which would be available for $25. That's not sure yet, and it probably wouldn't be till the end of the year. But if you want to get a hard copy, you can, but you can also read the entire book for free online. So anyone who's interested in it, you don't have to be saving money for it.
Yeah.